Okay, so this is just to document my current setup as of December 2022, and it's just for reference if nothing else, but it may be of some help to anyone else with a similar setup. So I have a Focusrite audio interface. It's an 8 in, 6 out, 3rd generation, which connects to a PC tower with Cubase 11 elements installed. I also have a Studio Logic SL73 MIDI controller keyboard, and the 5-pin MIDI output cable connects from this to the MIDI in on the Focusrite audio interface. So next up we have the 5-pin MIDI output from the Focusrite audio interface going into the 5-pin MIDI in on the Prophet Rev2. So next we have a connection from the Prophet Rev2 into the drum machine. So we're using the MIDI through from the Prophet Rev2 5-pin MIDI cable to the MIDI in on the TR8S Roland drum machine. So the lines I'm drawing here in paint are just for reference. Why have I connected it like this? Well, I want Cubase to provide the clock pulse for the Prophet Rev2 and the drum machine. So in Cubase, if I'm working with a tempo of 120 BPM, this project tempo will be sent via the MIDI clock to the Rev2 and out of the Rev2 and into the drum machine. So when I run the sequencer in the Prophet Rev2, or when I run the sequencer on the drum machine, it will be in time with the project tempo in Cubase. Another advantage of this setup is that in your digital audio workstation you can configure the output to trigger the drum machine. When you press record, it counts in 2 bars and you'll have a very nice clean recording for whichever length of audio you want. So you can create short loops and you can make changes in your drum machine on the fly, and it will record it. So the reason I've connected the MIDI controller into the audio interface is that I also want my keyboard, my MIDI keyboard, to trigger software synthesizers as well within Cubase. So if I load up an instrument track, my keyboard will be able to trigger all of the notes in the software synth. Before we move on to all the audio connections, just quickly, I have the MIDI keyboard USB connected to an iPad with a piano learning app installed. This allows me to practice my piano and use the USB port as a MIDI interface, which is probably the best way to connect any learning application to your MIDI keyboard. Let's get the audio connections out of the way and we can go and look at some of the settings in the hardware and the software. So I'm coming out of the iPad now. This is an audio connection coming from the headphone socket of the iPad going into line 1 of the audio interface. I'm going to draw all of the audio in a different color. I'm going to use red, and this will donate all audio connections. Next, we're connecting up the audio left and audio right output from the drum machine into the USB interface, audio in left and right 5 and 6. And finally connecting up the audio output left and right from the Prophet Rev2 into the audio input left and right, or 3 and 4 on the audio interface. Then in order to get sound, it's simply a case of connecting the left and right audio output from the audio interface into my active speakers. So we'll very quickly go over to Cubase and hit a few settings, and then we'll look at the Rev2 and the drum machine settings for this particular layout. So heading into Cubase, we need to set up our external sync. So we need to go to Transport, to Project Synchronization Setup. Under the Sources tab here, we need to just use the timecode source as the internal timecode. We go to Destinations. Under MIDI clock destinations, you need to check or select either your internal sound card or your USB MIDI audio interface. Under MIDI clock preferences, I just have this one checked. This just sends the MIDI clock when all of the external devices are stopped, so it's continually receiving a clock pulse, and everything else is just unchecked for me, which seems to work perfectly fine. So okay that. Okay, so diving into the Rev2, we need to go into our global parameters, our global settings. We need to locate the MIDI clock mode. We need to switch this to, well, this is preference because I don't want the DAW to trigger the internal sequencer built into the Rev2. Every time I press start or stop or record, I'm going to set up the Rev2 as a slave with no start stop. So every time I operate, play or record in Cubase, it won't automatically trigger whatever's sat in the sequencer here. Another setting we need to be aware of is the MIDI clock cable. It's coming in through the 5-pin MIDI, so we need to take it off USB and set it to MIDI port. And other settings to be aware of: the MIDI control is on, and yeah, your general settings are pretty much defaults for the rest of it. So that should be fine. And as you can see now, it's picking up the clock pulse here from the DAW, so it's being controlled by Cubase. Okay, so in the TR8S menu, we need to hit the utility, and we need to go into sync tempo, so we can leave this set to auto. You can manually change it by going in and taking it to MIDI, but auto seems to recognize that there is a clock pulse being transmitted or received from a DAW somewhere, and it automatically lines up with the project tempo. You'll see if I change the value to internal, it will obviously you'll have full control over the tempo. So we'll keep it on auto. We'll come back out, and we also, there is the receive start stop pulse again. So this is similar to the Rev2. If you want to turn it to trigger every time the DAW you record or press play in the DAW. It will trigger the drum machine, and this is good for when you've made a drum loop and you want it to be bang on time. So you can just hit record, you get a couple of clicks to count you in, and then it will just automatically start the drum machine from the first beat in the first bar, and you'll be able to record a loop in. And you can just quickly dip into the menu and turn it off again if you don't, if you're happy with your drum loop and you're not intending on recording any more from the drum machine, because it can be a little bit annoying when you are trying to do other things in your DAW, and every time you press play or record or whatever, it's going to trigger the drum machine. And obviously if you've already got a drum pattern in the DAW on any one of your tracks, it's going to it's going to trigger it every time, and you'll have two, have a double drum machine running, and sometimes it can be horribly out of sync as well. So you can turn that back off. I'll leave it off. Okay, that's my other settings for the Roland. Just a couple of other things you need to check in Cubase. If you haven't set this up already, you will need to go to your studio audio connections, and you just need to check that your inputs are set up for your audio interface. For, in my case, it's audio input 1 and 2. I also have input 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. If you remember from my diagram, input 1 is my Scoof piano learning app, so that's coming directly from my iPad. I have a preset which I can load up, and you will see that the Prophet Rev2 goes into input 3 and 4 as per the diagram, and the Roland TR8S is using inputs 5 and 6 of the audio interface. My outputs are pretty standard. They're just coming out to output 1 and 2, stereo output, pretty standard stuff. So make sure your audio connections are set up and you can see them all, and your preferred audio driver is loaded for your USB audio interface. So just one other little thing to check: make sure that you in your studio setup, your audio system, you're recognizing your audio interface. In my case, it's the Focusrite USB audio interface, and in your audio system driver is set up for your audio interface. Okay, you may have a few things in the list there, and you want to use your preferred audio device. Okay, in a MIDI port setup, obviously make sure that you're seeing again your USB, your interface, your audio interface, and that's all set up and it's visible and it's active. Okay, I'm probably not going to be using the wavetable synth much, so probably be sticking to my audio interface for everything that I need to do. Okay, so we're back in the DAW. We've set up all of our audio devices and our MIDI. We can now add a MIDI track. Check in the inspector that our input and output are set to our audio interface. With this track selected and record enabled, I should now be able to use the keyboard to trigger preset sounds in the Rev2 synth. Okay, so we can do a simple recording now. Just going to record 4 bars. Okay, something very, very simple. I don't want to get bogged down. What I will say though is I don't like that little note on the end, so I'm just going to select that. I'm just going to ditch that tiny little bit of a mishap there off the end. I'm going to quantize the hell out of it because I have to. I'm just going to play that back with the metronome on to see how it syncs up. Okay, it's nothing amazing. Try and quantize it to 8th note. I think I'll take that. I'll just shorten that note a little bit. Okay, so dead simple. Couple of MIDI keystrokes recorded in, triggering a preset in the Rev2. So far so good. So now I want to record some audio from the drum machine. What I first need to do is go into the utility on the drum machine, and if you remember, we need to set the sync stroke tempo receive start stop to on, and this is going to allow our drum machine to trigger at the first beat, the first bar, when we hit record in the DAW, and it's going to kick it off automatically, so we don't have to sit there with our finger on the trigger. I'm going to set up an audio track this time, and I'm going to select our audio input, our Roland TR8S, or it's the input 5 and 6, either one will do. And that's the audio track set up. So now when I go back with the record enable and the track selected, if I hit record, it should automatically trigger the drum machine. I'm going to mute the top track for now. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, so there's 4 bars of beats automatically triggered by the DAW, so I'm happy with that beat. I can go back to the Roland, and I can just quickly turn the knob here to select the receive start stop to off, because every time I audition what tracks I've laid down, I don't want the drum machine to kick in. I'm done with the drum machine for now. So if we take the mute off the top track, we hit the loop and we just play it with the metronome off. It's just going to be noise, but you'll get the idea. Okay, so I can change the presets in the synthesizer with these keystrokes, and it will play any preset. I can play around with the cutoff and the resonance and the frequency. I can make adjustments to it on the fly, and to spice it up a little bit, and you know, it will sound arguably a little bit nicer. But if I want to if I'm happy with the MIDI information that I've got there, and I'm happy with the preset or the patch that's in the Rev2, and I just want to record this MIDI information down to an audio track, I simply open an audio track, I select the input 3 and 4, the Rev2 as the source, the audio input, and I add that track. Now if I have the track selected and record enabled, it will automatically record, and I want to record this MIDI information up here, so I'll have just the MIDI information playing, the MIDI track playing. Okay, so if I hit record now, just going to disable the loop so we can go past the 4th bar, and if I hit the record now, it should record the audio signal from the Rev2. So let's mute that track, unmute this one, take it back to the start. What we should have now is an audio track from our drum machine and an audio track now from our synthesizer. Just set the loop up. And of course now I can unmute the synthesizer and scroll through different presets on the synthesizer to bring them to more sounds, or I can record some fresh MIDI strokes in